can do it. This is Anna.
There we go. Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Peter, for jumping in. So then back to you, Dr. Jane Egau. Welcome, and thank you for sharing your experience. You have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very, very much, Carlos, and everyone on call. I'm just going to tell you a story of how we went through the policy development process in Uganda. Maybe you'll pick something from it as we move on. I think let's just go on to the next slide so that I don't lose any of my 10 minutes. Let me start straight away by saying, first of all, thank you to UNESCO for very, very extensive support that we got as a country to develop our national teacher policy and also to start its implementation, which we are on now. Just to provide an overview, I want to say that the whole teacher policy development process started with identification of issues through a diagnostic study that was supported by UNESCO and launched in 2010. I just want to report also that it actually took us 2 years through this study to conduct this study, and its report was published in 2013. To date, that report is what we refer to as the key document that also enabled us to finally get to the policy. The findings and recommendations of that report were presented at a very high-level meeting officiated by the Minister of Education herself. And it was at that meeting that the recommendations of the report were adopted. Upon approval and the launch of that report, the actual teacher policy development process started in 2013. And I want to say that it also took us 5 years to go into implementation. And that policy was approved by Cabinet in 2019, and it was launched on the 5th of October on World Teachers' Day, just to emphasize the importance of that document to the teachers. It was launched on World Teachers' Day by the Speaker of Parliament, who represented the President at that level. So next slide. Now it is under implementation. I just want to take you through the very different processes and phases that we went through. First, as I have already said, we undertook a diagnostic study, and that was 2010, 2013. In phase 2, we now, once the diagnostic study was out, we set up a country technical team to develop this policy. When we had that technical team, we now start to develop the guiding framework for the teacher policy. And I want to point at this point that we used a lot of the documents from UNESCO to develop this guiding framework. Then we had stakeholder consultations on the selected policy dimensions. Then we undertook a regulatory impact assessment once we now had a draft of the policy, because the regulation is that you cannot even present this for approval unless you've done a regulatory impact assessment. What would this policy do once it's out there? Then we developed a costed implementation plan. And in phase 7, we went into the approval processes. In the Ministry of Education and Sports here, we have about 5 levels of approval. And so we went through those 5 levels, and eventually it was passed, and we went to phase 8, which was now the Cabinet of Uganda. And once the Cabinet approved, we then went back to do a baseline study, the purpose of which was really to establish where we are starting from in the implementation, and then we would be then able to monitor and the progress, and also measure how well or badly we are doing. And then now we are in phase 10, which is the implementation. Next slide. I just want to mention about that diagnostic study, that we got support from UNESCO to undertake this. We appointed a national level team, a team that brought together almost all stakeholders that are affected by the issues of teachers. It was, I recall, 35 members of the team, national appointed by the minister, and we consulted extensively for 2 years, and we produced a teacher report in 2013. Next slide. The findings of that study were varied. There were many. I have just summarized some here, but important was to note that we have a growing economy, yes, but also we have a growing population, quite high. And that means that there is a bit of pressure on the education system to ensure that we are able to accommodate these growing numbers. Also, that study pointed out one important thing, that teachers are the biggest workforce of the country, and therefore they have to be properly regulated. The second one was there was low teacher quality and inadequate numbers in some subjects. There was no data to support effective teacher training and deployment. There was low professionalism, high absenteeism, and attrition was quite high. Then there was low teacher salaries, and that limited and very limited opportunity for career growth. And I think most detrimental was that there was low teacher morale and dissatisfaction with their job. In this study actually said that it's only 29% of our teachers would remain in a job if they were given options, meaning that only 29% of our entire teaching force were fairly comfortable with the job. Otherwise, the rest of them were dissatisfied, and this definitely affects the way that we deliver education. Next slide. Next slide. So what were the recommendations in the report? The overall thing was that we needed to develop a national teacher policy. At that point, before then, what we had was separate policies tackling different things at different times. We didn't have some one document that would talk about teacher policy, teacher issues in the country. So the biggest recommendation of that report was that we need a national comprehensive teacher policy. Within there then would accommodate improvement in the quality of teacher and quantity of teachers. We would then accommodate the establishment of a management information system that would now help us to capture data, that also helps us to manage the teaching force, and then establish a teacher professional body to regulate the profession, because there was also the issue of poor professionalism, which was reported in that report. Then we needed to also address the issue of teacher motivation that I've just talked about, and we need to establish a mechanism of teacher involvement in the teacher development process. In the policy making process. Here I want to point out that there was a complaint generally from the teacher, especially the teachers union, that there is very little involvement of them in the process of policy making, and most times they just receive what has been dictated from above, which is a challenge. And so this was one of the things that this report aimed to address. Next slide. So overall, when this document was presented, the government of Uganda realized, and I think the need then for the national teacher policy was evident, that teachers are vital because of their impact on the learning, and therefore they need to be well coordinated, well trained. But besides that, the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda, it provides that no education system can be better than the quality of its teachers. Just to emphasize that the teachers are recognized as a critical resource in the education system. Then we have teachers are the biggest workforce in the country. I have already mentioned that, and therefore they need to be well trained and also well managed. Then the need to promote a common understanding among education stakeholders of what creates effective teaching. People always talk about the quality of education, but what is it that creates effective teaching? And this is one of the things that this policy aimed to address. And then the need to promote standards in teaching and learning. So the need for the national teacher policy was clearly identified. Next slide. The objectives of that policy are 4. 1, to streamline teacher management for better productivity, discipline, retention, and motivation. 2, to strengthen pre-service and in-service teacher training so as to enhance competencies to effectively deliver learning outcomes and leadership at all levels of the education cycle. And 3, to standardize teacher development, qualifications, and practice across all levels of the education. And then 4, to streamline cross-cutting issues into all aspects of teacher training, management, and practice. All the issues that we have talked about are captured in these 4 policy objectives. Next slide. I just want to point out the key strategies to address these objectives. Objective 1, we are talking about streamlining teacher management. One of the key things that we have agreed to establish the National Teachers Council by Act of Parliament to professionalize the teaching profession. and of course, operationalize the council to implement registration, accreditation, and motivation framework for teachers. The other, next slide. Two, in our attempt to strengthen pre-service and in-service, we have identified that we must establish the Ugandan National Institute of Teacher Education. This one, we are focusing mainly on providing leadership in continuous professional development of teachers and the training of tutors, because one thing was clear that the continuous professional development was not something that was streamlined and you do it at your own will. And yet it is a very, very critical aspect of teacher development. So we have agreed that we want to dedicate the Uganda National Institute of Teacher Education to lead the process of continuous development, streamline it, and people get points or credits for it as they go through the process. But also besides that, they will also coordinate now the rest of the teacher training institutions in the country, and all the accreditation will be done by them and the council. So 3, next, standardizing teacher development. We are talking about developing teacher standards, and we are going into that. And then the other 4th one is to ensure that all cross-cutting issues are embedded in the teacher training programs, so that whatever it is, the teachers should be able to handle the education issues or as all-round trainers and as implementers of education policy. Next slide. Current implementation status. I just want to bring you up to speed to where we are. 1, we developed the National Teacher Policy Implementation Standards and Guidelines. What we realized is that most policies are developed and they are put out there without clear implementation standards and guidelines. And that sometimes makes it difficult to implement. So we developed these implementation standards and guidelines, and it is what we are using now in the implementation. We undertook a baseline study, I already mentioned this, to provide a base for the M&E framework. Then we printed and disseminated the National Teacher Policy to all stakeholders countrywide. We have done so much in as far as dissemination and print and of the policy is concerned. Then we established the teacher management information system. This is now we are capturing all data of teachers online. And even now we know how many teachers do we have at what level of education. And this has been extremely useful. We developed a continuous professional development framework, which we hope the UNITE, the Uganda National Institute will use to implement the CPD programs. Then we developed a harmonization of initial teacher training framework. We also developed the teacher competence profiles for all education levels. We have developed a teacher incentive framework to make sure that our teachers are motivated in the process. We have developed a teacher social dialogue framework to cater for the concern that the teachers raised earlier, that they are not involved. Now we have that social dialogue framework that supports the dialogue that we have between policymakers and the implementers, especially the teachers. Then the establishment of the Uganda National Institute for Teacher Education is in progress. We are also establishing the Uganda National Teacher Council and also upgrading now the training programs, because one of the things in addressing quality, we said we are no longer going to have the low-level teachers we used to have, but only graduate teachers. So eventually we are now planning to upgrade all our programs to degree level, and we hope that within the next 10 years, we should only be having teachers at that level. Of course, the programs have changed. We used to have 3 years of teacher training. Now we are developing programs for 4 years to make sure that we have good teachers in the process. Next slide.
Dr. Egao, if you could wrap up in a minute or so. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just wrapping up now with the challenges. I just want to say that all this doesn't go easily. There are challenges along the process. You need to clearly articulate the challenges and how the policy will guide, will solve those problems. You need to identify who the champions are, because there are many negative forces you have to deal with. You need to have consensus building among different stakeholders. You need an alignment with other policy frameworks, national and internationally. We also need to establish a broad political will for the policy. Then financial commitment is a must. You must ensure sustainability among the changing circumstances, and you must also take care of the bureaucratic tendencies that generally slow the processes. Next slide. And then I just want to mention the critical success factors, because this is important for all of us. The diagnostic study was important because without it, we wouldn't have moved. Comprehensive stakeholder mapping and full engagement of the people was very critical. Then we needed government high-level commitment, which we got, and I think this is how we moved. A committed core team driving the entire process, a strong leadership and clear institutional anchorage. You also need an inclusive and accountable process that people don't doubt, and you need technical guidance and financial support, which in our case, we got from UNESCO, from ICBA, from the TTF, all those supported us in this process. And last slide. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Egao, for the presentation. I think it's very inspiring to see what are some of the elements that are needed in terms of institutional development, instead of convening of the stakeholders, the participation of teachers, and the many, it's very impressive, the many institutional process that have been created as part of the policy development process. I think those are some of the elements that we will be seeing in the upcoming presentations, and that some colleagues have actually remarked in the chat. So please do continue to use the chat so that we can capture your comments, colleagues. We'll open for questions and answers, but before that, thank you once again to Dr. Egao. We will now hear from the actual tools, the actual policy development guides that have been developed by ICBA and by the Teacher Task Force and UNESCO. So let me begin with Mr. Biniam Sisei Mendisu. As you know, he works for UNESCO's Institute for International Capacity Building in Africa, when he's in charge of policy development, among other issues. So Biniam, please show us the guide, and we can start.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well.
Okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. I'm very happy to be here, and a warm welcome from me as well. This is a joint presentation to be done by me and by Peter from TTF. So I'll start and he will join me in the middle. The main purpose of this presentation is to briefly introduce the major resources that UNESCO has developed over the years to support teacher policy development in Africa and globally. Next slide, please. Let me start by quickly introducing ICBA and TTF. ICBA is a Category 1 institute established in 1999 and mainly, mandated to strengthen teacher policy development in Africa. And we work very closely with the African Union, and we are very pleased that we coordinate the teacher development cluster of the Continental Education Strategy for Africa. And of course, we also try to implement the SDG 4. Next slide, please. And the Teacher Task Force is our International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. It's sometimes known as Teacher Task Force in short, is a global alliance working on advocacy, knowledge sharing, and country support. And it tries to also implement target 4C of the SDG 4, which is mainly focusing on teachers. And members of the TTF include intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, development agencies, and civil society organizations, private sectors, and UN agencies. Currently, there are 157 members, and 98 of those are countries and 59 organizations. And currently, since 2008, TTF is hosted by UNESCO. Next slide, please. Let me start, why we work with teachers, why we feel as UNESCO teachers are important. As Dr. Egao said earlier, teachers are at the center of any education system, and any education system is as good as its teachers. They are the most influential and most powerful force to bring about equity, access, and quality in education. At the same time, we understand that there are several challenges in the continent, especially the study by UNESCO in 2016 indicates that in order to meet the 2030 SDG goals, we need additional 17 million teachers. And so we see that there is a huge gap to be filled in terms of access, in terms of having more teachers. But it doesn't stop there. There are several issues in terms of gender imbalance and having unqualified and untrained teachers, and teacher motivation, and several other issues. And the same is true with the Continental Education Strategy for Africa. In its strategy objective 1, it talks about revitalizing the teaching profession to ensure quality and relevance. Next, please. And what is it like a bit about the context in Africa? The last 2-3 decades have witnessed an unprecedented rise in terms of access to primary and secondary education, and that's something to be hugely appreciated. But at the same time, we understand that there weren't, parallel levels of change in terms of quality of education. So we feel that there has been several issues and problems in the way teachers were recruited, trained, and professionalized. So we feel the continent has made huge strides in some aspects, but there is also a huge work to be done in terms of making sure education and learning outcomes are improved. And we believe approaching education through teachers, building the capacity of teachers, can bring about a lot of change. Next slide, please. And then, we understand that we are already in a dire situation, but the COVID-19, the pandemic over the last year and a half or almost 2 years has brought another challenge to the existing problems. And it has once again taught us how problematic, how many problems and challenges we have as an education system and what needs to be worked more. And in this regard, I think we have seen a lot of gaps, but at the same time, we have also learned how resilient our teachers are and how innovative and creative our teachers are. In this regard, we want to point out a recent publication by TTF on COVID-19, the policy implications, and a resource that we can use both in returning, what the implication in the closure of schools, but in the plans to return back to school. Next slide, please. And then, so our approach is that as UNESCO, we feel it's very important that we approach the issue of teachers in a very comprehensive and holistic manner. Trying to approach it by improving access or by bringing about more teachers won't do justice to the issue. So we feel that the issue of teachers has to be addressed comprehensively and holistically. By this we mean, one, it has to be aligned to national policies and strategies, but more importantly, it has to be also address all the different dimensions of issues with teachers. And it starts with recruitment. There is the issue of training. There is the issue of professionalization. There is a career structure. Horizontally, it should account all the issues in connection to teachers. And then vertically, it should also cover, encompass, everything from early childhood to higher education teachers. Next slide, please. So for this, UNESCO has been developing several resources and tools and materials to support member countries to address the issue of teachers comprehensively. And we wanted to bring to your attention 3 publications, especially the 2 guides that UNESCO-IICBA has published. The first one on teaching policy and learning outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa, which is published in 2016. And then another TTF publication, which is a generic publication on issues of teachers and teacher policies, which is a teacher policy development guide. And earlier, there was also a methodological guide for the analysis of teacher issues, which was published in 2010, which is very relevant in terms of analyzing in detail the issues of teachers. So these 2 guides, several countries have been, using them and applying them, but we hope they are still useful, and we wanted to work and to support countries by using these resources. The 2 guides are very similar in nature, but I just wanted to point out that the TTF guide is more generic, but the one published by ICBA is more contextualized to Africa. Next slide, please. And very briefly, the teacher policy and learning outcomes, the guide that was published by ICBA, it has, in terms of outlines, it includes some context and introductions about Africa. And then it also talks about how important it is to have a holistic teacher policy and a comprehensive one. And it emphasizes the role of teachers to meet the SDGs and continental education strategy for Africa. And then it talks about the 9 dimensions of teacher policies, from recruitment to retirement, but also from training to professionalizations. And then it also have the different processes of policy development and the key phases in policy development. And finally, it shares different tools and templates and materials that countries can use and adapt to their own particular context. Next slide, please. And the Teacher Policy Development Guide, published by TTF in 2019, also has a background section where it talks about purpose and scope and the audience. And there is also a section where we talk about the contextualizations and the importance of aligning such an effort with the national strategies and the policies. The dimensions, the 9 dimensions, are also discussed in this one. And it also includes a part where it talks about the different phases and processes and the roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders. And then there is the issue of costing and expenses and a time frame, which is also very important. Finally, there is another section which talks about and deals with the implementation. So this is by way of giving you a little bit background about the resources. And I now pass it to Peter to continue the presentation. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Benyam. I'll just thank you for that, for the contextualizing a lot of the information, and thank you very much for that. Well, I will just sort of continue on. So the Teacher Policy Development Guide, developed by the TTF, again, it complements and works well with the contextualized guide in Sub-Saharan Africa. It covers the 9 dimensions in quite a lot of detail. It's just to give you a bit of an idea. There's a summary version, and the summary version exists in 6 UN languages and also in Portuguese. The guide is a useful tool. It contains case studies, checklists, and various elements that make it a user-friendly and a good instructional tool. The full guide, of course, was it was completed in 2019 and updated, and it exists currently in English, French, Arabic, and Spanish. There is also this online course which has been developed by the UK Open University, and there are a number of versions of the course that can be done. So this is an online course where you can learn about the guide and how it's used and the different elements that are included. And we'll share this presentation, so these links can be obtained. Next slide, please. This is just to, some may be aware of this, but we would like to talk about the Teacher Task Force Knowledge Platform and Hub. So this was launched on World Teachers Day last year. And this is a place where all the information related to teacher policy, aimed at policymakers, aimed at teacher educators. And this is a repository for quality items and products, reports, policy documents, and various other resources that are useful for teacher policy development. So this is something that we have a curator working on, and this is a place where a lot of information is being uploaded on a regular basis. So this is a one sort of stop shopping where all things related to teacher policy work can be found. So I would encourage you to look at this resource. Next slide, please. Just to talk a little bit about, we keep talking about the different dimensions, and Binya mentioned them a little bit. There are 9 main dimensions in the document, and we sort of see the document as a living document. So this is something we think about in terms of improving it. Currently, there are 9. I'll just go over them quickly, so we know a little bit about them. The first being teacher recruitment and retention. We talk about how do we attract people to the profession, quantitative and qualitatively. How do we retain individuals as well? We talk about the issue of contract teachers comes up. It also talks about licensing and certification, and also, of course, a recruitment for school leaders as well. Teacher education, it talks about the initial and the continuing elements. What are the questions are, what is the nature and quality of the content of teaching? What kind of pedagogical training and clinical experiences are involved? It talks about the role of CPD in induction and other elements. It talks about training in situations of conflict. So it's quite exhaustive in that regard. We talk about deployment, how are teachers deployed equitably through different environments. It talks about rural postings, the balancing of family life issues. Next slide, please. We also talk about career structures. So what are the options for teachers to progress? Do they progress vertically through more hierarchical kind of career pathways, or more horizontally across schools? So some of these considerations come into place, and it discusses these elements. We talk about teacher employment and working conditions. What are the work hours? What is the class size related to pupil-teacher ratios? We talk about school resources. We talk about violence, student behavior, and a number of other issues. Of course, reward and remuneration talks about salaries and salary scales, talks about other incentives, performance pay. Next slide, please. And lastly, it talks about teacher professional standards. Who enters into teaching and what is a good teacher? What are the well-defined set of competency, ethical, moral standards, and those that belong to the teaching profession. We talk about teacher accountability and regulations that make teachers accountable. We talk about performance evaluations. And lastly, the last section is about school governance. So how schools are governed. It talks about school leadership and other structures and systems in schools. Next slide, please. So in terms of the phases of policy development, I think it's just sort of critical to mention at the very beginning that Miss Barry talked about the involvement of teachers throughout the process. The meaningful consultations with all the different groups are quite critical and should be embedded throughout the process. So teachers' voices, but also all the different units and departments that have a role in managing the work of teachers. A dialogue process is critical throughout. But there are basically 5 main phases: the issue identification and agenda setting, the development of situational analyses and setting priorities, followed by policy formulation, which is the bulk of the work related to teacher policy development, followed by adoption, implementation, and finally, of course, monitoring and evaluation for feedback loops in terms of how the implementation is rolling out. Next slide, please. The TPDG, so the guide was implemented in a number of countries already, as you can see listed here. And the TTF conducted a study that looked at how the guide was implemented, what were the results, what were the perceptions of countries. And this is being developed into a paper that is going to be issued by the Teacher Task Force in this year. Next slide, please. There's some key findings and that were found to be across countries in terms of processes.
Sorry, Peter, if we can wrap up in a minute, please.
Sure, thank you. We found there were both robust structures and procedures, but there are concerns about the effectiveness of social dialogue. It's quite critical, and this wasn't been advocated for. In fact, some countries found it to be useful enough that they developed special modules around social dialogue. But of course, dialogue across the board is very time-consuming. High-level commitment is critical, and but there's also more involvement required from teachers as their frontline policy implementers. Of course, the role of development partners is critical, and pedagogical autonomy is key. Next slide. In terms of resources, the guide has been considered very useful by countries. The 9 dimensions can be quite clustered quite differently depending on the country, depending on the organizational nature of the ministries and the priorities. Certain countries prioritize certain dimensions over others, of course. And as I mentioned, some countries also develop new dimensions around teacher autonomy, social dialogue in different situations. And support was provided by different development partners. That was a key element in terms of financial and human. Next slide. Just a few recommendations that come out of the work and the analysis, and that is including that a well-planned process of embedding structures and mechanisms of social dialogue are important. Need to have clearly defined roles which are anchored within the existing institutional structures in the ministries. National ownership is critical and high-level support, but international development partners should also play a clear role collaborating with the country aligned to the national frameworks. Developing these structures further is key for managing the development of the policies, and intersectoral cooperation with the Ministry of Education leading is critical. So the intersectoral cooperation with finance, but also elements across the ministries as well, so that organize teachers' work. Development partners play a critical role, and of course, in terms of financial support, this is an element where they can support. So next slide, please. And that is it then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter and Biniam, for this presentation. And thank you very much to Dr. Jane Egau for the experience shared from Uganda. Now we have a few minutes to open the floor for questions. We have heard from both presentations very good insights as to what are some of the enabling conditions for a teacher policy to actually work. We've heard about the attention on the number of teachers that's needed. We've heard about social dialogue as an enabling condition, the participation of teachers in the effectiveness and in the policy development as well. We've heard of monitoring and information systems, national teacher councils, the production of standards, and some others. And these are some of the dimensions that Biniam and Peter highlighted from the policy development guide. So then now let me open the floor to hear from participants. We have very little time, but I think we can have a round of discussion about what are the main policy challenges in your countries in terms of the 9 dimensions that have been presented, or in contextualizing, for example, the teacher policy guide to be used in a national context. So I don't know if you can raise your hand to take the floor. You can also type your questions or comments in the chat, but we'd like to hear from you. We have the question in the chat from that Anna posted. Thank you for that, Anna. So maybe just to hear from you, if you have any questions, any comments about challenges in your context in the terms of policy development. What are some areas as well that can be developed further for which guidance is especially needed? There was a question in the chat which was about the costing of education policy. Dulce Mungoy asked about how the costs were estimated. So I don't know if Dr. Egao can respond to that. Otherwise, Peter or Biniam about the costing of education policy as included in the guides. Dr. Egao?
Thank you so much. I'll just summarize our experience. What happened in our case was when we set up a team to work on this teacher policy, we got the 9 dimensions, and we formed 9 teams, and each team was handling a dimension. So in handling the dimension, they went into the details of what is it that is expected to implement what we are suggesting. So, and then they went into costing those elements or those cost drivers that would help us to implement that. On board, we had people from the National Planning Authority to guide us on what is it that government can do and what is it that is useful in this process. So we had, I must say, we had a team of experts, guiding little teams, small teams that focused on the different dimensions. And that's how eventually we came up with the costing. And I think that's it for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Egao. There was another question in the chat as to where the documents that you presented can be found.
Yes, the documents that we presented, we can share them. I think some of them are already online if you look at our education website, but also those that are not there, we can share them because they are now public documents that we are using.
Thank you very much, Dr. Egao. We have a couple of questions more. We'll give you. We'll ask them now. Let me just give the floor to one of the participants. Yes, Oyigoga Onu, we can hear you.
Hello, everyone. Am I audible enough?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay.
If you can tell us.
Oyigoga Onu speaking.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Oyigoga Onu calling, speaking from Nigeria, and my concern is about the focus on integrating the teacher policy document in a whole piece approach, because there's a tendency of taking the whole piece approach to be a very, very slow process. That is, when you capture all the aspects like the last presenter presented into a whole piece, it becomes so overwhelming for national governments to actually implement all of them at once, considering countries that run regional systems. So I have that piece of caution because according to national priorities, that is to say, the aspect of teacher policy that actually affects those governments that they need to address and focus attention more on them rather than taking it in a holistic approach. The fragmentary approach has that advantage of achieving success gradually, a gradual process, rather than, because I have, from Nigerian experience, I noticed several governments that come on board, they have holistic approach to solving teacher issues, the policies. But the problem, it always comes to final implementation. So if they are taking a piecemeal approach, I feel that would be a very good strategy in enforcing these policies, depending, just like the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to bring out that concept of contextualizing issues rather than taking a holistic approach to things. So this is my area of concern. The holistic approach is good, but in situations where the fragmentary implementation is required, this could come in. This is my concern. I don't know what other participants have to.
Thank you, Goga. I'm afraid you're breaking off.
Regard.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you. We got the comment quite clearly around the comprehensive vis-a-vis the more specific approach to policy development. So this is very well noted. And then we have Tesfai Bata. I saw your hand in the video. Did you want to take the floor? Go ahead, please.
Okay, hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you well.
Okay, first of all, thank you for everybody. And congratulations for Uganda. I want to elaborate the situation of policy development in Eritrea based on the questions that is sent on the concept note. Is possible?
Go ahead. Yes, of course. Please go ahead.
Here in Eritrea, the policy guide we are using are of different sources. One is civil personal administration document, CPA. CPA service to all administrative government workers, like wise teacher in Eritrea.
Senior management now.
Can you please mute yourself? Go ahead.
They are also administered by CPA, produced document which has a list of articles. Second, we have documents for all types of workers who are engaging. A variety of teacher-related documents dispersed at different documents of the ministry, like in education policy. We are aware that teacher policy should be holistic and comprehensive development document. So far, next of our task is to work on it. The advantage we have is the teacher policy that we are using is designed according to the country context. However, at this time, it is on process of reviewing. If I go to the next point, What are the main policy challenges in our country in relation to the 9 dimensions? Minister of Education is from the first countries that appreciated the teacher education, teacher policy guidelines and took initiative to adapt to the country context and develop comprehensive national teacher policy in collaboration with TTF Secretariat and reached at the stage of official launching meeting in the presence of Dr. Adam Adumbra and his colleagues. That was held in Asmara and started formulating committees as part of the preparation. Meanwhile, the government of Eritrea ordered the Minister of Education to conduct comprehensive education system review. At this time, the ministry is on process of conducting review. The review scope is very deep and serious with effects of sectors. The process has started as it is in an initial state. In such situation, as we all know, the teacher policy development task has to be to deal in line with the ongoing review, because the change will affect all ministries, bodies, including teachers. The 9 dimensions are generally well appreciated by the Minister of Education. Many of the points are almost similar to the policies existing in different education systems. At this stage, we are on the initial stage collecting data and creating awareness by conducting focus group discussion at various regions, consulting meeting, using the available policy documents on teachers and education, referring reports and research documents conducted by local and international education experts and literature review concerning teacher issues. So far, everything is fine. Though we are optimistic in our future stages, we are more conscious about the challenges we may encounter. We are ready to learn from the experience of other countries who are already adapted the 9 documents so far, and from those who are on process to adapt to the national teacher policy statement. We are expecting the collaboration and support from interested bodies in financing technical and experts. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tesfaye Bata, for sharing Eritrea's experience. We have very little time, colleagues, but we have time for one more question or comment. So maybe I'll give the floor to Ismail Abdi. Ismail, please go ahead. Very briefly, please.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking from Somalia, Mogadishu. Actually, we are at the moment developing, not actually developing, we have developed our first draft of our teacher policy. And we did a process, we followed a process of development of this teacher policy. We formed a task force, a committee, and comprising all teachers, educationists, and so on. And then we started looking for materials online. And one of the good things actually that came to our mind, to our discovery, was the availability of resources from UNESCO. The teacher policy development guide was actually very important use for us during the development stage of our policy, and we used it. It has actually reframed the context. The outline of the policy document. And I say thank you to UNESCO for that. And then we contextualized every dimension to our case in Somalia, and we had a lot of challenges here and there. And then we started developing all the 9 dimensions referring to our case, and we started doing the consultation within our department and the ministry, and then we have laid open to other stakeholders from the education fraternity, parents, universities, and so on. And at the moment, what we have is the challenge of implementing that document in it. And we have that obviously the first challenge is resource allocation for teachers. How are we going to do it? Data problems also, education management information system, we don't have all teachers. Obviously, one of the challenges in our country is security, and we cannot go to every station where a teacher is working. And we are continuing to develop, to embellish this document using the UNESCO development teacher policy development guide. And I will continue to learn. We will continue to learn from the team. And I want to say thank you to Dr. Igao of Uganda's experience, and I have actually learned a lot from her in this encounter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ismail, for your comments on the Somali experience. Definitely, the issue of contextualization is one that has come forth in a number of participations. Let me just, we have 4 more minutes, but very briefly, I would like to ask Dr. Egao. There were a couple of questions that have to do with the Ugandan experience, particularly the development of the social dialogue framework. Could you please say a word as to what the process, how it flowed, what are now the benefits or the difficulties of engaging in social dialogue with teachers, with teacher unions, in enhancing participation and ownership from teachers in the development of policy?
Thank you so much. You will recall that I mentioned that it came out of the diagnostic study that they were complaining. So what we did was to engage them. We now started the process of engaging the teachers union to develop this social framework together. So again, it was a group formed, and we had a series of meetings with different groups, both government and the teachers, and they would bring out really what should be done. In fact, to a great extent, we listened. We listened to them. We wanted them to tell us how best can we work together, because I don't know whether many of you may have followed Uganda stories earlier. We used to have a lot of strikes, and we came actually from that point. How can we reduce the strikes in this country with the teachers? And so they would tell us what should happen, which is not happening. And that is how we developed the social dialogue framework. What the social dialogue framework is doing is it states who meets, when there is an issue, who meets, when do we meet, what are we discussing, how often do we discuss them, to whom do we report, and who answers our questions, who invites when there is an issue, and what issues should we discuss. So it's a range of things. It's all compiled in a document. So when we meet, we know how to operate the meeting because we have agreed. We know when to meet. We know who should invite a meeting. We know when an issue is brought on the table, who should take it up. It's that kind of thing. It is a framework that helps us to know how we should address our issues and how we should take them forward. Otherwise, initially, whenever there was a complaint, the teachers would just go either to government or they declare a strike or something like that, which is not happening now. In fact, ever since we developed the social dialogue framework, we've not had a single strike of the teachers in this country. So it's been an excellent thing, and we are happy.
Very impressive indeed, Dr. Egao. Thank you very much for sharing that. And thank you very much to all for your participation. We trust Victoria will be able to share in the plenary in just 5 minutes the most important takeaway lessons from this session. Thank you very much to all presenters, Dr. Egao for presenting Uganda's experience. Thank you, Viniam and Peter, for presenting the policy development guides from ICBA, UNESCO, and the TTF. And thank you. I can see a comment coming from Yumiko on social dialogue. We have 20 seconds, so see you in the plenary. Thank you all very much for your participation. We'll continue in the plenary, so see you there.